Good morning, everybody. So again, my name is David. I'm the Nature Preserve Officer within Parks and Rec. Parks and Rec is a huge department across the city, and it's broken up into little divisions like trails, urban parks, recreation, aquatics for swimming pools, and I'm in the natural areas division. So our parks are managed as nature preserves, and they're meant to support the native plants, the native wildlife, and the natural ecosystems. And a lot of them are located over aquifer recharge zone, so that's also kind of accounted for in our land management plan. I'm super excited. This is going to be my first time giving this presentation, and I hope to be able to keep giving it. One of the best ways to support wildlife is to bring a little bit of native plant life into your own home. A lot of native wildlife, including the little bugs, right, suffer from habitat loss, and this is one of the best ways to kind of reconnect the little pockets that are left. This picture here is from my phone. All of these flowers are currently growing in my garden. They're not all currently in flower, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but this was in April. I tried to get a picture of every single different flower growing in my garden. This is like half of them. So it's possible. And this is really just a handful of years worth of investment. And it's like an ongoing passion project because I like bugs. And you get bugs when you have flowers. So we're going to look at a little bit of everything. So natural areas parks are located for the most part on the north side of the city, but as I mentioned, they are managed very differently because we take into consideration the Edwards Aquifer Recharge, all the water that we rely on. And they're very different from urban parks, which there's 260 parks across San Antonio. There's a bunch of parks. Most of them are considered urban parks, so there will be areas where they just mow the grass flat, and for safety reasons, it's not necessarily a bad thing. But they don't take into account what is growing there and the wildlife that lives there. A home garden is sort of an opportunity to kind of merge the two and bring those native species into an area you're in control of and kind of hit some goals that you'd like to reach. So this is a picture of my garden bed, also from spring when it was really happy. But everywhere there's wildlife. There's birds, there's lizards. I counted 5 different lizard species in my yard this year. And this isn't my garden, but this is at Hardberger, which is the park that I office out of. We have a children's vegetable garden, and even if you have a vegetable or herb garden, there's still ways that you can bring in a little bit of native pizzazz to mix it up. But native gardens are also very valid and very important. And if you have a vegetable garden, you do want to understand that you may have some pests that aren't necessarily pests. So you may want to mix in some native food for those caterpillars so they're not eating your tomatoes. And that's a swallowtail caterpillar on rue, which is an herb. And I planted it at the garden too, there. So this is a map of the natural areas. And as you can see, down here we have Medina River. It's the only one really kind of out of the way. It's one of the most beautiful natural areas. It's got a river going through it. So the wildlife, the plants, the whole ecosystem is very different than most of the other natural areas, which are located way up north and a little to the west. Natural areas parks are, for the most part, purchased with Edwards Aquifer Recharge Protection Funds. So the whole reason they exist is to protect our water source. I work out of Hardberger, which is number 8 on there. It's a little more central, but the parks that I manage are way at the top: Classen Stubing Ranch Park, Panther Springs, Gold Canyon, and Stone Oak Park. There's a lot of benefits to a native plant garden, and most of them you can guess. One thing is attracting native pollinators. Butterflies are beautiful. They're also kind of facing a lot of barriers to success lately. This here is a buck moth. It's probably my favorite moth species. They host on oak trees. So if you have an oak tree, you may see some of these in your yard. Native gardens support native ecosystems. So insects altogether have had a decline of 9% per decade. That's a lot. The biomass is shrinking a lot. And a lot of people don't like bugs. I'm not against squishing a mosquito or spraying a roach, especially if they're in your house. I understand that. But outside of that, out in nature, they're like a super important base level of our survival in the long run. And native gardens aren't the solution to everything, but it's a nice little way to slowly make an impact. And the more people that have native gardens, you start to connect the pockets for those animals. It can reduce your water usage a lot. Native plants, once they get established, you don't really need to water them. I have watered mine because we've had a lot of drought, but it's not very much that I've watered. It's nothing like elephant ears, big, beautiful plants, not native. They require a little more water than some of the native things that you see. Native gardens will minimize your landscape maintenance. You do still have to maintain any sort of space. If you have a lawn, you have to mow it, right? You have to water it. But it will be a lot less with a native garden. You kind of let native plants do their thing, and then you'll kind of reap the benefits of that. For the most part, they don't need fertilizers and pesticides. Because they're native to this area, and some of them are endemic, meaning they're only found in this area, they don't need anything extra. They are evolved over thousands, millions of years to live in this part of Texas. So whatever sun they get, whatever rain they get is perfect for them, and they should thrive once they're established. And pesticides, there are bugs that are going to be eating some of your plants. And if you don't want those plants, there's plenty of other plants you can choose that aren't necessarily going to be covered in caterpillars. And then just personal enjoyment. Everybody that has to work sometimes need to relax. And so after work, I'll sit outside, I'll let my dog run around, and I'll sit outside for 20, 30 minutes and just enjoy the bugs. That's my thing. And birds and lizards and all the little wildlife that have been attracted thanks to what I've done with my yard. My yard used to be all just grass, and now it's a quarter of that is just native plants, and it makes me really happy. Who are native pollinators? It's a really diverse group of animals that you could potentially be supporting. It's not just butterflies and bees. There's beetles, there are ants, there are mosquitoes, actually, are pollinators. Tons of birds, amphibians, mammals, like bats are actually pollinators, depending on the species. Even snails and slugs can be pollinaters, and they're not necessarily bad in your garden, right? They're bad in your vegetable garden, but they're not necessarily bad if they're on your cowpen daisies. When you are planning your own garden, you can try to focus on specific pollinators, but you're very likely to get more than what you're expecting, and that's not a bad thing. And I kind of just want to instill on that. Not every thing that you find in your garden is bad if they're native, and there's ways to kind of deal with them depending on your tolerance of what you want to have there. When it comes to flowering plants, and that's what we're focusing on, is flowering plants, there's all kinds of natives. There's grasses, there's trees, there's vines, but we're going to look mostly at flowering plants today. They provide 3 super important resources. Nectar, which is what the butterflies and a lot of the other insects are going for, hummingbirds, but they also are super important sources for pollen. Everybody's familiar with honeybees, and we like honey. I could live off of honey because of my sweet tooth. But there's hundreds and thousands of native bee species that are not honeybees. Honeybees are European. They don't even belong here. And if you want to support bees, it's much more valuable to support native bees. And a lot of them rely on pollen of these native plants. And there's an American bumblebee. And then leaves and hosts. In order to have butterflies, you have to have caterpillars. It's part of the cycle. So depending on what plants you have, you may be able to provide host plants and food sources for those little critters. There's a picture. So a lot of caterpillars are opportunistic and they can eat a bunch of different kinds of leaves. And some caterpillars are very specific on what they can host, and they can only eat a specific individual species of plant or that family of plants. Most folks are familiar with the monarch over here, that it can only host on milkweed. And there's different kinds of milkweed, and I think I have it on there somewhere, some of the different kinds of milkweeds. But they can't eat anything else. So if you want to support monarchs and you want to raise the caterpillars, you're going to need a whole bunch of milkweed and probably different kinds of milkweed. But you can still support the monarchs by providing their nectar sources. The adults feed on a whole bunch of different flowers. Other caterpillars can eat a whole bunch of different kinds of leaves and aren't as picky. But it's just something to consider when you're choosing your plants. Fruiting and seeding plants are also really important to kind of mix into your garden, especially for birds. And I like birds. I don't know enough about them, but I know that I want to feed them because native birds, some of them rely on specific things. So here's a list of a whole bunch of plants that either provide seeds or provide fruit. The American beautyberry makes these really pretty, like fluorescent purple berries and clusters that birds will then use the rest of the summer and fall until they're gone. Inland sea oats are a native grass that I've also seen more commonly in landscaping because it's great. It doesn't grow super tall. It grows maybe like a foot to 2 foot. And it gets really dense with these seeds that then wildlife relies on in winter when everything else is dead. Seeds are high protein, high fat content, so they'll sustain the wildlife during winter when everything else is gone. I put little asterisks next to plants that are actually people edible. So like mesquite, you can eat the seeds. It's a lot of work if you do it yourself, but they are people edible. The Texas persimmon, I've made Texas persimmon bread and it was amazing. You can eat acorns. It's a lot of work. Agarita berries are super tiny but really tasty. Candelia beautyberry. So if you were into foraging, those are a few options you could fold into your garden that you can also enjoy with the birds. It's also important to consider how plants grow. So there's annuals. These plants only live for that year. Once the seed germinates, they're going to live their whole life cycle and die by the first freeze. These plants will rely on either you reseeding or whatever plants you grew reseeding the area themselves. And you don't want to mow annuals while they're flowering or seeding because you don't want to interrupt that or you won't have any next year. These do require a little bit of a delayed maintenance. But it's not a bad thing. If you can endure a little bit of ugly, then you'll be able to have bluebonnets every year, a great example. So these come up earlier in the year. Once their seed pods start to dry, they kind of pop open. You can cut them and save them right before they pop open so you can control where they grow next time. But the seeds will actually pop out in the summer or early summer, late spring, and then they'll sit on the ground and they may germinate that fall. So you may have little seedlings that sprout right now in November. It's November already. They might sprout in November and stay on the ground as like a little leaf or two and wait for those very early year rains, and then you'll have your flower. So you just want to be mindful of where your annuals are so you know, there's a bluebonnet. I don't want to dig it up on accident. Or you don't want to mow if they're still flowering. So those are examples of the same plant. So that's lemon bee balm, which is a really great plant, but when it's dry, it's kind of ugly. And then these are fire wheels, and they're also kind of ugly when they're dry. But you'll have a ton of seeds if you let them get to that point. Perennials live for several years, and these are also super important for wildlife. A lot of times perennials will bloom more than once in the year. These plants you can prune and cut back, and that'll sometimes encourage growth depending on when you're cutting them. Again, you don't want to mow or cut them back while they're flowering. You want to wait until the flowers are done and you start to see seeds. And these are 3 good examples. Mealy blue sage is one of the, well, all of these are great. It's had a really hard time kind of limiting which plants are great because there really are a whole bunch. Did you have a question?
I do. Can you plant liatris?
Oh.
Ask your question. I'm going to give you the mic so that I get it on the record.
Thank you. Can you plant?
It's on. It's just for the recording.
Can you plant liatris in straight caliche?
That's a good question. I don't know.
Thank
a
you.
lot of these plants do require specific soil requirements. Caliche is more like clay.
No, it's limestone. I hear
Oh.
in the panhandle,
Oh.
here it's straight limestone.
Most of these will need a little bit of soil. There's one that I'll point out, I think is on the list. Copper Canyon Daisy is like really great with almost no soil if you wanted a flowering plant. I'm not sure about liatris though. When it comes to native gardens, patience will pay off. When plants first go in the ground, when you buy them at the nursery, they're usually small and they usually, well, they look pretty, but they're a fraction of what their potential is because they're seedlings, they're starters. You may get a 1-gallon pot and you may end up with a 6-foot wide bush full of flowers. We usually have like a saying, sleep, creep, leap. So the first year, they just really need to survive, and you want to make sure it doesn't die. And that's the only time they should really need maybe some extra watering to get an establishment of roots. The second year, you may see a little bit of growth, or you may see a lot of growth. It kind of just depends on how happy they are. But by the third year, they should be super happy and kind of explode in size. And if they're not thriving on that third year, then it's probably not a good location due to the soil or the sunlight that they're getting, or maybe they're getting an area that stays wet for too long. A lot of the plants evolved for the ecoregions here in Bexar County don't need a lot of water once they're established. And then this is a picture of a Abbott's bagworm moth. They make a really cool cocoon, and they're in there for a long time, so patience. Seeds, however, germinate on their own time. So after this, I'm going to give everybody a little bag with some native seeds, and I'll tell you what's in there. Not all of the seeds will germinate the first year. It's maybe like, I have the percentage there somewhere. A big fraction of them are likely to germinate the next year, but some of them will sit and wait a year or 2 years until their internal mechanisms will say, it's time. I've gotten the right amount of water. I've gotten the right temperature windows. I'm ready to germinate this season. And then there's some seeds that don't grow at all. And there's a small fraction of the seeds that we have, of the seeds out in nature that are just duds. And hopefully those are the ones that get eaten instead of the good ones. Timing and planning is important. Some plants you can stick in the ground several times throughout the year. If you have a tree, there's a great large window of when you can plant the tree. I think October and November is actually a pretty good ideal time, but trees have a bigger planting window than some other things like bluebonnets. If you buy them at the store, you only want to plant them really early in the year because once summer hits, it's not the time for bluebonnets. So just think about it. Some nurseries will sell plants in less ideal seasons to plant them, but for the most part, things are pretty aligned. When you get a native plant, you don't want to leave it in the pot too long. Plants do great once they're actually in the ground. They're much happier. Water flows a little bit better. I had some milkweed in a pot and it was one little twig with a leaf, and I left it in there for a year, and it was one twig and a leaf for a year. And then I put it in the ground this year, and it got really big. It's a non-native, so don't do that. But it got huge, like within a couple weeks of sticking it in the ground. So plants are just generally more happy when they're actually in the ground and not in a little pot that's going to restrict their roots or dry out super fast. So try to not leave things in pots for too long. When to add seed? Autumn is the best time. Right now is the best time to add seeds to your garden for next year. So the native seeds that I'm going to give you don't require a lot. You just want to have an area that you're going to remember not to mow over, and spread them out pretty wide, and they just need soil contact. They don't need extra watering right now. They shouldn't need extra watering next year. You just want to sprinkle them and maybe even gently walk over them to press down the seeds to ensure that there's soil contact. That's the most important thing for the seeds. You don't even need to bury them. Native seeds in the wild will just fall to the ground at the base of the plant. So a lot of times you see them in clusters, and it looks really pretty because you have a nice chunk of color in the area. Pruning, you usually want to wait until after the last chance of freeze. We don't freeze very often, but we did have a really weird February a couple years ago, right? So you want to make sure that there's no more freezes coming, and then prune it back, which means if you're dedicated to a native garden, you have to be okay with a little bit of brown for a while. And it may look messy and it kind of may look ugly, but there's insects that are hibernating, so to speak, in there. There's lizards that are ruminating in the plants there, and it is really vital for the wildlife. The birds are still relying on the seed heads of last year's plants all the way up through March, until the bugs really start coming out. If you are going to collect seeds and deadhead, you can do that pretty much any time. So if you see seeds on a plant and they're already starting to dry up, go ahead and collect them so you can put them somewhere you want to sow new seeds. Deadheading is when you have a flowering plant, and let's say it's a zinnia, which is non-native, but it's a good example, and zinnias are great. When you have a zinnia, they make lots of flower heads, and if one flower dries up, you can cut the head off and more flowers will come. I guess you can do that with roses too. A bunch of flowers, you can deadhead, cut them off, and it'll prompt more flowers to start growing. When you have your native plants, and you can get the direction from someone at the nursery, or a lot of times it's on the plant itself, consider the sunlight needs. A lot of plants here, native to Central Texas, like a lot of sun, and I actually have a hard time because I have an area with a lot of shade, but now that I've been in this job for a while, I kind of know which ones will go there. Consider the moisture needs. For the most part, our plants that are native to Bexar County don't like deep soil and a lot of water, unless they're going in a creek. So cattails would love a creek. Some of the flowers and grasses that we have can't handle too much water. You can overwater and kill some of your native plants. Consider the soil needs, and you may have to do a bit of research depending on which plant and planting time. So summer is not a good time to put plants in the ground. It's just going to be too dry. We might not have any rain. Last year we had a very rainy summer, so it was like green the whole year. But this year it was really dry. And consider the space needs of your plant. So some plants, like I mentioned, they may start out tiny, but if you know that this plant is going to grow 6 feet wide, 6 feet tall, you don't want to plant it in a little tiny corner by your front door because it'll block your entry. Barriers are not a bad idea depending on how you want to organize your space. If all you have is a small patio or balcony with some pots, you can still have native plants. You just don't want something that's too big. If you have a huge yard, well, maybe you want to make sure you still have a clear barrier so you can mow the large area. So maybe you want to consider some logs or some rocks or some metal trim or something just to kind of help you separate the plants you want to keep more wild and the plants that you do need to kind of cut back or mow. And layering. Layering is always a good idea. It just supports more wildlife, and it can be more visually appealing. So if you have a tree, well, pick something that's maybe a different color of leaves than the tree. Pick something tiny that's close to the ground and layer it with a shrub and then a bigger bush and then a tree. And then this is bristlegrass. So again, I'm focusing mostly on flowering plants, but there's a bunch of really great grasses that you can also find. And some of them I think are on the back of the resource, but this is a really nice one. Also, when you consider choosing your plants, it's great to diversify your garden, not just for you, but for the pollinators. So consider the color. I don't like red flowers, but a lot of animals like red flowers, so I've got some red flowers. Consider the flower shape. So I have some flowers that grow in little clusters because they're interesting, and I've got some that make single big flowers. Consider the purpose. So I want everything, so I've got a little bit of everything. But if you want to have more butterflies, then focus on nectar plants and try not to have host plants if you don't want to have the caterpillars. And you'll still get butterflies if you have a bunch of flowers that provide the nectar. If you want to practice some bird watching, choose some plants that are going to be very dense with seeds like sunflowers or cowpen daisy, so that when it does come to seed time, you'll be able to enjoy the birds. And consider the bloom time. This is a big one to make your garden appealing to wildlife throughout the whole year. Some plants only bloom at certain times, and some plants bloom throughout the year when there's rain. So this plant here is elbow bush. And elbow bush, along with agarita and redbud, bloom very early in the year. So elbow bush can bloom as early, and agarita as early as February if they get a good rain. And that's sort of some of the first plants that will start to support bees kind of recuperating after winter, and you'll see butterflies and other stuff start to happen once you have some of these flowers in your area. Fall bloomers like frostweed, I'll show a picture in a little bit. Frostweed, in my garden, I have a stand of frostweed that I didn't know what to expect. And the first year that it came up from seed, it was the tallest and the greenest and the luscious looking plant in my garden, but it didn't have flowers all year until November. And then it was just clouds of white and full of butterflies, monarchs, queens, and everything in between. So I really like frostweed, but it can take over an area because with all those flowers came a ton of seeds. Now I have got it everywhere. There's some year-round long-time bloomers. Mist flower is really great. Greg's Blue Mist, which I'll show a picture again in a little bit. You can have flowers the whole year on that plant, and you'll see butterflies there all year. Then there's rain-induced bloomers like kidneywood, which is my favorite bush, and cenizo is the Texas sage that makes those like grayish-green leaves and then little purple flowers. So when they get a good rain, they'll just be full of color and full of pollinators. Again, I tried to shrink my list, but I kept thinking, oh, I really like this one, so I added them. But here's some of those flowers. I put stars by some of the ones that I think are the best of the best. So like Greg's Blue Mist is this one here, and it's a really pretty like periwinkle color. Cowpen Daisy is this one, and they'll get really tall and really full of these yellow flowers, and pollinators love them. They are a host leaf, so if you're lucky, you'll see a bunch of caterpillars from the, I think, bordered patch, but I haven't been that lucky. I just got flowers, which isn't bad. And then frostweed is this one here. So this frostweed looks short. The frostweed at my yard got to like 8 feet tall. And then right now it's blooming, and I've got lots of monarchs in my yard. And when I bump into other naturalists and my coworkers, and they're like, I've only seen one monarch. I'm like, I've got a bunch. And it's frostweed to thank for that. And you can also mix up the shape of your plants. So this is red yucca. I really like red yucca. And hummingbirds really like red yucca because of the shape of the flower. And I planted a red yucca a few years ago, and it was like 3 sad little leaves. But now that it's had maybe 5 years to grow in, I'm getting flowers like that, really dense, and I'm seeing hummingbirds when it's blooming. And then frog fruit at the very bottom. Frog fruit, I didn't stick a picture, which I wish I'd had a whole slide for frog fruit. Frog fruit is the superstar. Frog fruit is a very low-growing plant. It can be used as a ground cover, but it'll bloom throughout the year, and it really is like one of the best plants you can get. Also with a native garden, you want to mind the volunteers. So there's always going to be some work and some weeds that you want to take into consideration, but think about it and learn about it and figure out what it is before you just start yanking. Sometimes seedlings don't look a lot like the adult plants, so maybe it's something that you do want to have in your garden. Are they native? That's the first thing to ask yourself. If it's non-native, go ahead and yank it out, which is something I struggle with because some non-natives are really pretty and do make flowers, but I'm trying to be strong and pull out things that are non-native. That's my struggle. Are they aggressive? So cedar sedge grass is a little tiny grass. It almost looks like a little onion, and it makes little tiny bulbs. But once you see it, it's like a never-ending battle to pull out cedar sedge, and it'll just take over. And like it's kind of pretty, but that's not what I want. I want flowers and I want bugs. And cedar sedge is just grass. It's not. Actually, I don't know if it's native. I think it's native, but I don't like it. And then do they flower? So dandelions and sunflowers can be volunteers. They may pop up where you don't want them to, but they're not necessarily bad. Sunflowers in general are great. Even if they're in an annoying place, sunflowers are actually really great plants to have. They're great for most pollinators, and then they make seeds that lots of birds rely on. And dandelions, they can be annoying, especially if they're big and pokey, but they are edible. I think most of them are edible. Ask if the plants are toxic to people or pets. So there's a native poinsettia that's all green, and it doesn't look like the pretty ones that you buy at the store. And is native. It belongs here. It makes seeds. It makes little flowers for the tiniest of pollinators. I've got it all over my yard. I've kind of given up because it just pops up. And it's not the ugliest. It's not the prettiest. It's just kind of there. But it is toxic to pets if they eat it. Nightshade is another one that's toxic if you eat it. There's other nightshade is a big group of plants, right? So that includes things we do eat, like tomatoes, potatoes, eggplants, and some other things. When people have vegetable gardens and you have pests on your plants, a lot of times they're looking for the native version of that plant. And silverleaf nightshade is our native version. It's all over the city. It's everywhere. It's not bad unless you're eating it, which I don't see why you would. It's not appeal. It doesn't look good to eat. But a lot of times if you have a big caterpillar on your tomatoes, it's looking for the native one. So if you don't have pets, and if you yourself are not going to just be munching through your garden, it's really great. It makes beautiful purple flowers when it does flower. And if you have a tomato garden, it's somewhere you can put the bugs for them to eat. But if you do have pets or you have little people, then you don't want to have silverleaf nightshade in your garden. And then are they edible and forageable is something that I'm starting to be more conscious of. Prairie tea is just like a weed that pops up everywhere. It's native, but you can't make tea out of it. One of my volunteers more recently, cleaning out her garden, she said, well, I've got a lot of it. I might as well try making tea out of it. And it was pretty good. I've got it all over my yard. I haven't decided if I'm just going to toss it or try to make tea. But it does make flowers, and it's great for teeny tiny pollinators. So I leave it for now. And then native ground covers. So if you're trying to remove lawn, I put a few down here that you may consider. So horse herb, straggler daisy, is a very low-growing ground cover with pretty little green leaves that are kind of heart-shaped and little teeny tiny yellow flowers. You've probably got it in your yard already. But if you wanted to, you could sort of encourage it to take over and remove grass around it so it has space to spread. Frog fruit is the superstar again. It's great as a ground cover, but it does take a little bit of time to get established. But once it's there, and it's wonderful. And then prairie verbena can get kind of dense. But if it's not an area that you're walking, it's an area that you don't mind being native, prairie verbena is really great and makes beautiful purple flowers. And then just kind of see who stops by. So this is from my yard. So those are when I did have zinnias. I can't grow them anymore, but I did have zinnias at one point. And I had some beautiful swallowtails. And then this is a sphinx moth. I don't remember what kind, but a big one. I like big bugs. The bigger, the better.
David, real quick, what was on the last slide?
Oh, this is agarita. Thank you. So agarita is really cool. One of my favorites. Kind of hard to find. I've only found it at one nursery here in San Antonio. It was like $50, so I said, I'll wait. But it's native. It has these pokey leaves, so it's one of the plants that's deer resistant. Deer like to eat lots of things, but they have very particular tongues. They don't like it if it's pokey. I mean, who would? So when it does flower, the flowers aren't munched up. And when it does fruit, the smaller animals get to enjoy it. So like squirrels and birds and bugs. But I absolutely love this plant because when it flowers, it just smells amazing. Smell is another thing you can take into consideration when you're choosing your plants, because some of them, like agarita, kidney wood, whitebrush, the smell is just amazing. But that's agarita. And you can eat the berries too. So one thing is to know your local nurseries, and don't be afraid to ask questions when you're there. And they may not know the answer, but as long as the name of the plant is on there, you can probably find it online. So I'm not affiliated with these. I don't get a discount at any of these. But Rainbow Gardens, I live really close to the one on Bandera, and I love it. It's big. They usually have a great native plant selection, and they've partnered with the Alamo Area Master Naturalists to have a really good selection of native plants, and they've got a bunch of them labeled really well, so that's the place that I like to go. Pollinators is a location out in Converse, and that's a little bit newer nursery. I haven't been out there, but I've heard good things about what they have. Nectar Bar was a little nursery business started by Drake White. She used to volunteer out at the park that I work at a whole bunch. And she's usually got a great selection. She has things sometimes that are harder to find, like the agarita was at her garden, and it was great. I just didn't want to. I wanted tacos that morning instead. Lately, HEB has been adding more and more native plants into their nursery area, and they partnered with the Native Plant Society of Texas. The Native Plant Society has monthly meetings. Here in San Antonio, we have a chapter, and it's actually at the park that I work out of at Hardburger. And they're open to the public, and every month they present on some native plant topic. But anyway, HEB partners with them and has had a really good selection lately that they'll kind of rotate through. So it's worth just seeing at HEB what plants they got. Also, keep abreast of parks events for free native plant giveaways. At most of the bigger parks events, we try to have our horticulture division give out native plants. So they were at the Pollinator Festival. Arbor Day is next Saturday. I'm sure there's probably trees, Arbor Day, right? But probably also some pollinator plants they'll give out. Dairy Days is a program. I have a flyer for it in the back. It's also coming up in 2 weeks. We're going to give away some plants there. Earth Day in April, Monarch Fest in October. We have a Bee Day, we have a Vulture Day. As many programs as we can, we try to give out free native plants for our community. This is a really great website that we use all the time internally. So for native plant resources, the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center website has a really great compilation of information about native plants. And it's wildflower.org, and you can kind of just explore the website. They have an area called Plants for Central Texas. It's just a list of plants that would be great in this area. I think our area is Zone 9, so that may be a flag that you see for some things, but for the most part, it means they grow great in this environment. I encourage you to do a little bit of research. I've provided a small example. There's hundreds of native plants, and I picked some of my favorites to put on that list that y'all picked up. But do a little bit of research, kind of Google each one, say, oh, this is a pretty flower. Oh, I don't really like that color. Or this is a host plant and I don't want to have worms everywhere. Before you go start spending your money and investing in what you'll have in your garden. I use an app like daily called Seek, and it's just SEEK. And it's a great identification app on your phone. It's a small download. You don't have to make an account. It's all free. And the software is really good at identifying what that plant is based on the leaf. One thing to consider is that, especially with Lowe's and Home Depot, they may say that a plant is great for xeriscaping, or is native, but it may not be. A lot of plants, they have one version here and another version in Florida or another version in California, and it may not be the species that's actually native here. So sometimes those apps can help just to identify what species it actually is and just confirm what you're getting before you buy it. But I've found from time to time stuff at Lowe's and Home Depot too that I've added to my garden.
David, I have a question.
Sure.
Where is the best place to confirm that it is native? Like where, once I know what it is, I go to Home Depot, I'm like, oh, this is actually this name. Where do I go to ask, is this native?
So if it's one of the local nurseries, I would just ask the staff. For the most part, they're really well versed, but I would double check with the Lady Bird Johnson wildflower. They've got really great, more exhaustive list than what you'll find at a nursery. Or you can always reach out to any of the natural areas staff. We love questions like these. It's a nice change from what we usually do. Yes.
You know, SAWS has a really great website.
Oh, mm-hmm.
And that's what I always use when I'm looking for a plant or when I want to find the characteristics of a plant, where it grows, what sort of water it requires or sun. So it's the SAWS site is very, very good.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. SAWS, I think they still have their water saver program, but they've got lots of great resources on water saving plants and native plants. Thank you for that one. Some other suggestions for your garden, multi-layered structure. So it all depends on how much space you have and kind of what aesthetic you're looking for. But having different levels, whether it's with soil or just with the plant heights, is just more visually interesting. But also birds like to live in different areas or hang out in different parts. So some birds are at the very top of the tree and that's their favorite place to hang out. Some birds like to hop around underneath bushes because they're looking for seeds and bugs in the ground. So really depending on what you want to see, just consider a couple different layers. Even if you have a really large pot, add some low plants in the front and some bigger plants in the back. Barriers, I think, again, are always a good option. Just to save yourself some of the work. So before you just plant things everywhere and throw seeds out, you may want to consider, okay, well, I don't want to pull out cedar sedge everywhere, so I'm going to clear out this barrier, lay down some rocks or lay a fabric or something. Even just mulch can be a barrier to save yourself a little bit of work later. Water is also really great. I'm not against feeding birds. If you want to see birds, but water is a lot more useful to the native wildlife because they can find food everywhere. But sometimes, especially with some of the droughts that we have here, water is a really great resource to mix into your garden. Hardscaping can be visually interesting. So I have a garden bed in the middle of my yard, and I had a tree that died, so I cut it down and threw it in the middle. And I've seen so many lizards just kind of sunning themselves on the log that I'm really glad I threw it there. And then just thinking about future maintenance. So like if I have to mow a certain area, making sure you have enough space or to go around corners, or just keeping that in mind when you're building it. I like this little picture. If something's not eating your plants, then your garden's not part of the ecosystem. So again, just don't be afraid if you have some holes in your leaves. It's not necessarily a bad thing. This are those bordered patch caterpillars on cowpen daisy. I think this was at the Japanese tea garden or the sunken garden. Every year we participate in a national butterfly count. So we go out twice a year and count all the butterflies and the caterpillars too. So that was a really great bunch of caterpillars that we saw. But then these are from my garden. So this is a monarch on my frostweed. And then these are some native bumblebees on buttonbush, another great plant to have in your garden. Yeah, that's most of it. So if you see a person picking up bugs, it's probably me. These are the caterpillars of the buck moth. That's that one I showed at the first part. That's my favorite. Yeah. Any questions?
Do you know of any profusely flowering native plants that are going to withstand swiftly flowing water in a floodplain that is going to, that the water is going to decimate probably within 5 days at the most?
Floodplain flowering plants. So Ruellia is a pretty good plant that does well with areas with a lot of water. I see them on the edge of the San Antonio River, and I see them at more, I guess, placid water, like Woodlawn Lake. They're all over the edge. But Ruellia comes in different kinds. There's little Ruellia that's purple or violet. There's a white Ruellia, a Mexican. There's Metz Ruellia. There's another tall one. And it's usually the tall one that I see near water, and it's got pretty purple flowers too.
Right, and are those native? I thought the only one that was native was the little one with the purple that grows in the shade.
The little one is native. The little violet Ruellia is
That's
native.
the one I thought was native. Those
there
other
may be
ones.
one of the tall ones. I'm not sure what species it is. I would say take a walk near the San Antonio River. If you've ever been to Confluence Park, if you go down, they have a whole bunch of flowering plants along the river. Vines are not necessarily a bad thing. I see a bunch of passion vine down there, and that plant is not necessarily sturdy, but it's very resilient. So it'll get ripped out, but because of the way their roots are, they'll pop back up super easily. So passion flower is
Thank
one I
you.
would. Sure.